Welcome back, motherfuckers. Today we talking black-eyed peas, and I don't mean the damn band. These peas came from Africa, brought here on slave ships, feeding our people through the hardest times, motherfucker. On plantations, black-eyed peas kept folks alive when nothing else would grow alongside okra, and that's why you'll find them together today. Protein, fiber, iron high, keeps your heart strong, lowers cholesterol, manages blood pressure, also fights diabetes, and keeps you regular. These peas fix nitrogen in the dirt. That means richer soil for everything else. Taking nitrogen from the sky and lightning to placing it in the soil, jackass. Plant them with corn, okra, cucumbers. Now they all thrive together like family, jackass. Even throw them next to your melons, but let them tendrils sprawl out first. From slavery days to New Year's Day, black-eyed peas always been tied to survival and luck if you into superstitions. Respect the pea, motherfucker. Been feeding us, healing us, and fixing soil for centuries.
On December 19, 1852, Attorney Augustus Pemberton stood before the Henrico County Court and read aloud a will that would tear apart one of Virginia's most prominent families. The last testament of Violet Harrington, deceased just 3 days earlier at age 41, left her entire estate to a man named Daniel Freeman. The estate included Willowbrook Plantation, 3,200 acres of prime tobacco land, 117 enslaved people, the main house with all its contents, investments worth approximately $73,000, and various properties in Richmond. The total value exceeded $200,000, making it one of the largest estates in Virginia. Augustus Pemberton's voice remained steady as he read these provisions, but when he reached the final paragraph, his voice faltered. Daniel Freeman was not a distant relative or business associate. He was, until the moment of Violet Harrington's death, legally her property. An enslaved man who had served as her house steward for 12 years. The courtroom erupted. Violet's brother, Nathaniel Harrington II, lunged toward the attorney, screaming that the will was fraud. Violet's 2 adult children from her first marriage demanded the document be destroyed. 3 cousins who stood to inherit nothing began shouting about insanity and undue influence. But Augustus Pemberton had anticipated this reaction. He calmly produced a second document, a marriage certificate dated September 7, 1851, signed by Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman, witnessed by a minister and 2 other parties, recorded in a courthouse in Pennsylvania where such marriages were legal. The courtroom fell silent. Then the chaos resumed, louder than before. Because if the marriage was legal, and if Virginia was forced to recognize it under federal comedy laws, then Daniel Freeman was not receiving an inheritance as a former slave. He was receiving it as Violet Harrington's legal husband. The case that followed would last 4 years, destroy 2 families, expose secrets that powerful people had spent decades hiding, and force Virginia courts to confront questions they desperately wanted to avoid. But the real story began 16 months earlier, in a library at Willowbrook Plantation, where a dying woman and the man she loved decided to take a gamble that would outlive them both. Before we continue with the story of Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman, and the inheritance that shattered Virginia society, if this story intrigues you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And please let us know in the comments what state or city you are listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts around the world. Virginia in 1851 stood on the edge of catastrophe, though most white residents refused to acknowledge it. The state's economy depended entirely on enslaved labor. Its social structure was built on racial hierarchy. Its political power derived from the 3/5 compromise that counted enslaved people as partial persons for congressional representation while denying them any actual rights. Wealthy planters controlled state government, federal congressional seats, and most local offices. They lived in manor houses, sent their children to universities, and convinced themselves that the system they profited from was somehow natural, inevitable, and even benevolent. But cracks were showing. The abolitionist movement was growing in northern states. Enslaved people were escaping via the Underground Railroad in increasing numbers. Free black communities were expanding, demonstrating that former slaves could thrive when given opportunity. Some white Virginians, particularly in the western mountain counties, were questioning whether slavery was worth the moral and economic costs. And beneath the surface, in kitchens and quarters and whispered conversations, enslaved people were planning, organizing, and waiting for the moment when the system would finally break. Willowbrook Plantation sat in Henrico County, just outside Richmond. The property had been in the Harrington family since 1768, passed down through 4 generations. The main house was Georgian colonial style, brick with white columns, built in 1792. Behind it stretched fields of tobacco, the cash crop that had built the Harrington fortune. Further back were the quarters where 117 enslaved people lived, worked, and tried to maintain their humanity in a system designed to destroy it. Violet Harrington had been born Violet Ashmore in 1811. Her father owned a shipping company in Richmond. Her mother came from a tobacco plantation family in Louisa County. Violet received the education expected of wealthy Virginia girls: music, French, literature, dancing, and the social graces required to marry well. She was considered exceptionally intelligent, which her tutors treated as a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be cultivated. Intelligent women made poor wives, they believed. They asked too many questions. They had opinions on subjects best left to men. They made their husbands uncomfortable. At 19, Violet married Preston Harrington, heir to Willowbrook Plantation. Preston was 28, handsome in a conventional way, educated at the College of William and Mary, and utterly unremarkable in every aspect, except his family's wealth. The marriage was arranged by their parents, a strategic alliance between shipping money and plantation land. Violet and Preston barely knew each other before the wedding. They learned to tolerate each other afterward. The marriage produced 2 children, Randolph, born in 1831, and Lydia, born in 1833. Preston treated fatherhood as a duty discharged. He provided for his children materially but showed little interest in them as people. He spent most of his time managing plantation business, drinking with other planters, and visiting Richmond, where he maintained a mistress that everyone knew about but no one acknowledged. Violet threw herself into managing the household and, increasingly, into reading. The Willowbrook Library contained over 3,000 volumes, collected by generations of Harringtons. Violet read voraciously: history, philosophy, political economy, natural science. She educated herself far beyond what her tutors had provided, developing opinions and perspectives that she learned to keep hidden from her husband and his associates. In 1843, Preston died suddenly at age 41, a riding accident officially. His horse threw him during a hunt, breaking his neck. Some whispered that Preston had been drunk, that the accident was really suicide, that gambling debts or other problems had driven him to it. But officially it was a tragic accident, and Violet became a widow at 32 with 2 children and a massive plantation to manage. Under Virginia law, Violet did not automatically inherit Preston's estate. The property should have passed to Randolph, the eldest son, with Violet receiving a widow's portion and serving as guardian until Randolph reached majority. But Preston's will, written just months before his death, for reasons he never explained, left everything to Violet with full control. Randolph and Lydia would inherit when Violet died, but until then she had complete authority over Willowbrook Plantation and all its assets. The male relatives were furious. Preston's brother Nathaniel particularly resented a woman controlling such wealth. He challenged the will, claiming Preston had been mentally incompetent when he wrote it. The legal battle lasted 2 years and cost thousands in attorney fees. Violet won, but the victory made her enemies within her own family. From 1845 to 1851, Violet ran Willowbrook with surprising competence. She hired capable overseers, made shrewd business decisions, and proved that a woman could manage a large plantation as effectively as any man. She also gained a reputation for being less brutal than most planters. She refused to use whipping posts, forbidden the separation of enslaved families, and generally treated the people she owned with marginally more humanity than was standard. This did not make her a saint. She still owned human beings. She still profited from their forced labor. But on the spectrum of Virginia planters, she was toward the less monstrous end. Daniel had arrived at Willowbrook in 1839 as part of an estate settlement. He was 17 years old, born enslaved on a plantation in Caroline County. His mother had been a house servant who taught him to read and write in secret, a crime under Virginia law, but one she committed anyway, because she wanted her son to have knowledge that might someday help him find freedom. His father was unknown, possibly the previous owner, possibly another enslaved man. Daniel never learned the truth. When he arrived at Willowbrook, Daniel was assigned to work in the tobacco fields. He was strong, intelligent, and careful never to draw attention. He survived by being competent enough to avoid punishment, but not so remarkable that he became valuable as specialized labor, which might mean being sold away from the only community he knew. In 1846, the Harrington house steward, an elderly man named Moses who had served the family for 50 years, died of a stroke. Violet needed someone to manage the household staff, coordinate daily operations, and serve as the face of enslaved labor to the white family and their guests. The position required intelligence, discretion, and the ability to navigate between two worlds, the quarters where enslaved people lived and the main house where white family conducted their lives. The overseer suggested Daniel. He had noticed that Daniel could read and write, that he had a careful mind and diplomatic temperament. Violet interviewed Daniel personally, something unusual enough that it caused comment among the household staff. She asked him about his skills, his background, his thoughts on how the household could be managed more efficiently. Daniel answered carefully, demonstrating competence without seeming threatening, showing intelligence without appearing presumptuous. Violet hired him as house steward, effective immediately. The position came with slightly better living quarters, better food, freedom from field labor, and authority over the 23 enslaved people who worked in and around the main house. It also came with constant proximity to Violet herself, to her children, and to the daily intimacy of household life. For the first 3 years, the relationship remained purely professional. Daniel managed household operations with quiet efficiency. Violet dealt with him as she would any competent employee, giving instructions, receiving reports, rarely engaging beyond what was necessary. But they existed in the same spaces for hours each day. The library where Violet spent her afternoons reading. The dining room where Daniel supervised service. The front parlor where Violet received guests and Daniel managed refreshments. Proximity created familiarity, familiarity created conversation, and conversation created something neither of them intended. It began with books. Violet noticed Daniel looking at titles on the library shelves when he thought no one was watching. She mentioned one day that if he wanted to read something, he should feel free to borrow books. Daniel looked at her with surprise and suspicion, wondering if this was a test, a trap to catch him violating laws against enslaved literacy. "I know you can read," Violet said quietly. "Moses told me before he died. He said you were the smartest person on this plantation and that intelligence was dangerous only if unused. I would rather you used it." Daniel borrowed a book on Roman history, returned it 3 days later, having clearly read it thoroughly, borrowed another on natural philosophy, then political economy. Violet began leaving specific books out, curious what he would think of them. They began having brief conversations about what he was reading. Daniel was careful at first, offering only safe observations, avoiding anything that might sound like criticism of slavery or Virginia society. But Violet pressed him. What did he think of Montesquieu's arguments about climate and culture? How did he interpret Adam Smith's theories about labor and capital? Did he agree with Jefferson's writings on natural rights? And if so, how did he reconcile them with Jefferson's slaveholding? These were dangerous conversations. Every word could be used against Daniel if Violet chose to. But she seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts, treating him more like an intellectual companion than property. Daniel began taking risks, offering real opinions, engaging in actual debate. By 1849, they were spending an hour or more each day in conversation. Ostensibly, these were household management meetings, but they had become something else entirely. They discussed books, politics, philosophy, the future of Virginia, and the nation. They debated whether slavery could be reformed or must be abolished entirely. They analyzed the moral implications of owning human beings while claiming to be Christians. They talked about everything except the impossibility of their situation. Violet's children noticed the unusual closeness. Randolph, 18 years old in 1849 and preparing to enter the College of William and Mary, found it distasteful. His mother's reliance on an enslaved man's opinion seemed to him a sign of weakness, an inappropriate blurring of boundaries that should remain absolute. Lydia, 16 and more perceptive than her brother, saw something else. She saw her mother becoming animated in ways she never had with her father. She saw Daniel's careful mask slip occasionally to reveal genuine emotion. She understood that something was developing that society would never tolerate. In September of 1849, Violet became ill. What started as a persistent cough developed into something more serious. Dr. Leonard Ashby, the family physician, diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis. At that time, it was a death sentence. Some people lingered for years. Others declined rapidly. There was no cure, only management of symptoms and hope for spontaneous remission. Violet received the diagnosis with characteristic composure. She asked about prognosis. Ashby estimated 2 to 4 years, possibly longer with careful management. She asked about treatment, rest, fresh air, nutritious food, avoidance of stress. She nodded and thanked him for his honesty. That night, alone in the library with Daniel during what had become their usual evening conversation, Violet spoke about her diagnosis for the first time. Dr. Ashby says I have perhaps 3 years, possibly less. Daniel, who had been arranging books on a shelf, stopped moving. He stood frozen for several seconds before turning to face her. I am sorry, miss. Are you? I should think my death would be a relief. One less owner in the world. It is not that simple. No, Violet agreed. Nothing is simple. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Violet spoke again. I have been thinking about what happens after I die. The plantation will pass to Randolph. He is not a cruel person, but he is conventional. He believes in slavery completely, never questions it. I worry about what will happen to the people here under his authority. We will survive, miss. We always do. Survival is not enough. You deserve more than survival. Daniel looked at her directly for the first time in their conversation. What I deserve is not relevant to what I will receive, miss. What if it could be? What if I could arrange something before I die that would give you real freedom, real opportunity? How? You cannot free me. Virginia law requires freed slaves to leave the state within 12 months. And even if you did free me, what would that accomplish? I would have to leave everyone I know, go somewhere foreign, start over with nothing. What if there was another way? Over the following weeks, Violet outlined a plan that was audacious, probably illegal, and certainly scandalous. She would travel to Pennsylvania, where interracial marriage was legal. Daniel would travel separately to avoid suspicion. They would marry there legally. Violet would then write a will, leaving everything to her husband, Daniel Freeman, the surname she would help him choose. When she died, if the marriage and will were both legally valid, Daniel would inherit the entire Willowbrook estate. Daniel's first response was to think Violet had lost her mind. The plan had so many ways to fail. Virginia might refuse to recognize a Pennsylvania marriage, especially one between races. The family would certainly challenge the will. The courts might rule the marriage invalid on grounds of her enslavement of him, making consent impossible. Even if everything worked legally, Daniel would be inheriting a plantation full of enslaved people, making him a slaveholder, the very thing he despised. But Violet had thought through these objections. The marriage would be legally valid in Pennsylvania. Federal comedy laws required states to recognize marriages performed legally in other states, even if those marriages could not be performed locally. Virginia courts would have to recognize the marriage. The family could challenge the will, but if the marriage was valid, Daniel's inheritance rights as a husband superseded other claims. As for the moral problem of inheriting enslaved people, Violet proposed that Daniel would immediately begin manumitting everyone, a process that would take time but could be done. He could sell the plantation to finance relocating freed people who wanted to go north, or he could keep operating it as a paid labor farm, something almost unheard of in Virginia, but theoretically possible. Why? Daniel asked finally. Why would you do this? Violet looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because I have lived 40 years in this society and participated in its evil. I owned you. I own over 100 other people. I have profited from their forced labor. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can perhaps use my death to create some small justice. And because... She paused, then continued quietly. Because I have come to care for you in ways that I should not, but cannot help, not as property, not as an employee, as a person whose mind I admire, whose company I value, whose freedom I want to see more than I want my family's approval. You are speaking of feelings that are impossible, yes, illegal, certainly, immoral by the standards of everyone we know, but true nonetheless. Daniel sat silent, processing this confession. Finally, he said, I would be lying if I said I did not feel similarly, but feelings do not change reality. You are my owner. Any relationship between us is by definition exploitative because you hold all the power. Which is why we would marry in Pennsylvania, where I would have no power over you, where you would be legally free to refuse, where whatever we chose would be our choice, not one imposed by bondage. They debated the plan for weeks. Daniel saw all the ways it could fail, all the dangers it presented. But he also saw the opportunity it offered, not just for himself but for everyone at Willowbrook. If he inherited and freed them all, over 100 people would gain liberty. That was worth tremendous risk. In July of 1850, they made their decision. They would attempt it. The logistics were complex. Violet could not simply leave Virginia without explanation. She announced to family and friends that her health required travel to mineral springs in Pennsylvania, a common treatment for consumption. She would be gone several weeks, accompanied by her lady's maid Clara and 2 other servants for propriety. Daniel would need to be away from Willowbrook simultaneously, but without creating suspicion. Violet arranged for him to travel to Richmond on an extended errand purchasing household supplies, a task that could plausibly take a week. She provided him with travel papers identifying him as a trusted servant on plantation business. In late August of 1850, both left Virginia separately. Violet traveled north with her small entourage, stopping at various locations to maintain the appearance of a health journey. Daniel traveled to Richmond, then disappeared onto a northbound train using the travel papers Violet had provided. They met in Philadelphia on September 2, 1850. Violet had rented rooms in a boarding house using a false name. Daniel arrived separately, posing as a free black man traveling on business. For 3 days, they finalized their plan, consulted with an attorney Violet had hired to ensure the marriage would be legally sound, and prepared for what they were about to do. On September 7, 1850, at a small church in Philadelphia, Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman were married. The minister was a Quaker with abolitionist sympathies who asked no questions about their backgrounds. The witnesses were 2 members of the local free black community whom Daniel had met through Underground Railroad contacts. The ceremony was brief, simple, and legally binding. They spent one night together as husband and wife in a Philadelphia hotel. It was the only night of their entire relationship where they existed on equal legal footing, where neither owned the other, where their connection was purely voluntary. They talked through the night about what they hoped to accomplish, what dangers lay ahead, and what their marriage meant. The next morning they returned to their respective roles. Violet resumed her identity as a wealthy Virginia widow. Daniel became her enslaved servant again. They traveled back to Virginia separately, maintaining the fiction that they had been in different places for different purposes. When Violet returned to Willowbrook in late September of 1850, she resumed her life as plantation mistress. Daniel resumed his position as house steward. Nothing outwardly changed. But everything was different. Violet immediately contacted attorney Augustus Pemberton in Richmond. Pemberton was known for discretion and for being willing to handle unusual cases. Violet explained what she needed: a will that would transfer her entire estate to Daniel Freeman. Not to my servant Daniel, but to my husband Daniel Freeman, with the marriage certificate as supporting documentation. Pemberton was shocked, but professional. He advised Violet that such a will would certainly be challenged, that Virginia courts might find ways to void it, that her family would never accept it. Violet acknowledged all of this and instructed him to write the will anyway. The will was completed and signed on November 12, 1850. Violet placed it with Pemberton for safekeeping, along with a sealed envelope containing the marriage certificate and a letter explaining her intentions. Pemberton was instructed to open the envelope only upon Violet's death, and to execute the will exactly as written regardless of family opposition. For the next year, Violet and Daniel lived in an impossible situation. They were legally married but could not acknowledge it. They cared for each other but could not show it publicly. They planned for a future they would never share, knowing that Violet's death would be the moment when Daniel finally gained the freedom and resources he needed to help others. Violet's health declined slowly through 1850 and into 1851. The consumption worsened gradually. Some days she felt well enough to manage plantation business. Other days she was confined to bed, coughing blood, struggling to breathe. Dr. Ashby visited regularly, providing laudanum for pain and sympathy for suffering he could not cure. Daniel cared for Violet throughout her illness, with devotion that household staff noticed and found touching, though they misinterpreted its source. They thought he was simply a loyal servant attending his dying mistress. They did not know he was a husband caring for his wife. In October of 1851, Violet called her children to her bedside. Randolph was 20 years old, in his final year at college. Lydia was 18, being courted by several suitable young men. Violet told them about the will she had written. She did not mention Daniel as beneficiary, instead saying vaguely that she had made provisions she believed were right and that they should trust her judgment. Randolph was immediately suspicious. What provisions? Who inherits? You will learn when I die. Until then, it is my business to manage as I see fit. The plantation should come to me. I am the eldest son. Father intended. Your father left everything to me. I will dispose of it as I choose. The conversation ended badly, with Randolph storming out and Lydia looking worried. After they left, Daniel helped Violet back to bed. She was exhausted by the confrontation, struggling to breathe. They are going to hate you when they learn the truth, Violet said quietly. They already hate me. I am property to them. This will simply give them different reasons for the same hatred. I wish we had more time. We have the time we have. It is more than most enslaved people ever get with the people they love. It was the first time either had used the word love directly. Violet took Daniel's hand, squeezing it weakly. I do love you. I need you to know that. This is not just about justice, or redistribution, or striking against slavery. Those things are true, but they are not the whole truth. I love you, and I wish we lived in a world where that was possible without all this deception. I love you too, Daniel said quietly. And when you are gone, I will do everything we planned. I will free everyone here. I will use what you have given me to strike against this system in every way I can. Your death will mean freedom for over 100 people. That is what our love created. Violet died on December 16, 1852, at 9 in the morning. Daniel was with her, holding her hand, whispering that she had done something good, that she would be remembered not for the evil she had participated in, but for what she tried to make right at the end. She died peacefully, a small mercy. The household went into formal mourning. Messages were sent to family members. Funeral arrangements were made. And attorney Augustus Pemberton was notified to begin executing the will. Pemberton arrived at Willowbrook on December 18th with the sealed documents. He met with Randolph, Lydia, and other family members in the library. He opened the envelope Violet had left with him and read aloud the letter explaining her intentions. The letter was direct. Violet acknowledged that what she had done would seem incomprehensible to her family. She explained that she had married Daniel Freeman in Pennsylvania in 1851, that the marriage was legally valid, and that she had left everything to her husband, as was her right under law. She asked her children to understand that she had done this not to hurt them, but to try to create some justice from the wealth her family had accumulated through slavery. She hoped they would not fight it, but she acknowledged they probably would. After reading the letter, Pemberton read the will. Then he presented the marriage certificate, properly registered in Pennsylvania, bearing Violet's signature, and Daniel's, witnessed and legally recorded. The room erupted exactly as expected. Randolph screamed that it was impossible, illegal, a fraud. Lydia sat stunned, trying to process what she had heard. Nathaniel Harrington, Violet's brother-in-law, threatened to kill Daniel immediately. Other relatives demanded the documents be destroyed. Pemberton remained calm. He was a lawyer, comfortable with conflict. He explained that the marriage was legally valid under Pennsylvania law and that Virginia was required to recognize it under federal comity principles. He explained that as Violet's legal husband, Daniel had superior inheritance rights to any other claimant. He explained that challenging the will would require proving either that the marriage was invalid or that Violet had been mentally incompetent, neither of which could be proven. He was her property, Nathaniel shouted. She owned him. A marriage cannot be valid when one party owns the other. The marriage was performed in Pennsylvania, where Mr. Freeman was legally free the moment he entered the state. Mrs. Harrington had no legal power over him there. The marriage was between two free individuals, both capable of consent. She was insane. Consumption affects the mind. She was not competent to make these decisions. Dr. Ashby examined her regularly until her death. His records show no evidence of mental incapacity. She was physically ill, but mentally sound. The arguments continued for hours. But Pemberton had prepared well. Every legal challenge had a counter. Every objection had an answer. The will would stand unless a court ruled otherwise. Daniel stood silently through all of this, watching wealthy white people argue about whether he had the right to inherit from his wife. Several times, family members addressed him directly with threats or insults. He responded to none of them, maintaining the dignity that had kept him alive through years of bondage. Finally, Pemberton announced that as executor of the estate, he was legally required to transfer all property to Daniel Freeman, effective immediately. The family could file legal challenges, but until a court ruled otherwise, Daniel was the legal owner of Willowbrook Plantation and all its assets. Including the slaves, Randolph asked with vicious sarcasm. Is he their master now? Under current law, yes. All enslaved people at Willowbrook are now the property of Mr. Freeman. The implications of this were almost funny if they were not so horrifying. Daniel, who had been enslaved property 3 days earlier, now legally owned over 100 people. He had gone from the bottom of Virginia's racial hierarchy to a position of substantial property ownership in 72 hours. But the situation was more complex than simple property transfer. The enslaved people at Willowbrook knew something extraordinary had happened. News had spread through the quarters about Mrs. Violet's will, about Daniel somehow inheriting. They did not yet know the full story, but they knew their world had changed in ways both hopeful and terrifying. On December 19th, Daniel called a meeting of all enslaved people at Willowbrook. They gathered in the largest barn on a cold winter evening, worried about what this new master would demand of them. Daniel stood before them and told them everything. He told them about his marriage to Violet, about the plan to use her death to create freedom, about his intention to begin manumitting everyone as quickly as Virginia law allowed, about his plan to sell the plantation to wealthy abolitionists and use the proceeds to help freed people relocate north or establish themselves as free citizens in Virginia if they chose to stay. The response was stunned, silence, then questions, then cautious hope. Clara, who had served as Violet's maid and had traveled with her to Pennsylvania, confirmed the story. She had been one of the marriage witnesses. She had kept the secret for over a year. Several older enslaved people who had known Daniel since he arrived at Willowbrook spoke up, vouching for his character, saying they believed he would do what he promised. But there was also fear. The Harrington family would fight this. Virginia courts might void the will. Even if Daniel won legally, powerful white people might simply kill him and claim he had died in an accident. Freedom was being offered, but it might be snatched away before anyone could claim it. Daniel acknowledged these fears. He told them he could promise nothing except that he would fight with everything he had to make good on what Violet had tried to give them. That the next months and possibly years would be uncertain. That they would have to trust him and work together to resist the forces that would try to restore the old order. The meeting ended with tentative solidarity. Daniel was not yet trusted completely, but he was no longer seen as just another owner. He was something unprecedented, a bridge between enslaved and free, using the master's own tools to dismantle the system. The legal battle began on December 23, 1852, when Nathaniel Harrington filed a challenge to Violet's will in Henrico County Court. He made 3 arguments. First, that the marriage was invalid because it violated Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws regardless of where it was performed. Second, that Violet had been mentally incompetent due to her illness. And third, that Daniel had exercised undue influence over Violet to fraudulently obtain the marriage and inheritance. Augustus Pemberton filed responses denying all 3 claims. The marriage was valid under Pennsylvania law and must be recognized by Virginia. Violet had been mentally competent, as proven by Dr. Ashby's records and multiple witnesses. Undue influence was impossible to prove and required evidence of coercion, which did not exist. The case became a sensation. Newspapers across Virginia covered it extensively. Some described it as a tragic case of a dying woman deceived by a clever slave. Others framed it as evidence that slavery was corrupting white moral character. A few abolitionist papers celebrated it as a brilliant strike against the slave system from within. The trial began on February 14, 1853, in Richmond. Judge Thomas Crawford presided, a conservative jurist known for strict adherence to legal precedent. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and members of Virginia's planter class who saw the case as a threat to their entire way of life. Nathaniel's attorney, Benjamin Wickham, was one of Virginia's most prominent lawyers. His strategy was to prove that Violet had been manipulated by Daniel over years of inappropriate intimacy, that her illness had weakened her mental capacity, and that the marriage was a fraud designed to steal the Harrington estate. Wickham called multiple witnesses. Family members testified about Violet's increasingly strange behavior in her final years. Neighbors described seeing Daniel in the library with Violet for hours at a time, suggesting inappropriate familiarity. Dr. Ashby was pressured to testify about whether consumption could affect mental function, though he carefully stated that Violet had shown no signs of cognitive impairment. The most dramatic testimony came from Randolph Harrington. He described his mother's declining health, her withdrawal from social obligations, her increasing reliance on Daniel. He painted a picture of a vulnerable woman manipulated by a cunning slave who recognized an opportunity for wealth and freedom. "She was dying," Randolph said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was weak, in pain, desperate for comfort. He took advantage of that vulnerability. He made her dependent on him emotionally and then convinced her to marry him and give him everything. It is the worst kind of exploitation." Under cross-examination, Pemberton dismantled Randolph's testimony. He established that Randolph had been away at college during most of the period he was testifying about, that he had minimal contact with his mother in her final years, that his description of her mental state contradicted Dr. Ashby's medical records, that his primary concern seemed to be his lost inheritance rather than his mother's well-being. Pemberton also presented his own witnesses. Clara testified about traveling with Violet to Pennsylvania and witnessing the marriage. She described Violet as fully in control of her faculties, making clear decisions, understanding exactly what she was doing. "Mrs. Violet was the strongest woman I ever knew," Clara said. "Even dying, she was stronger than most healthy folk. She knew what she wanted, and she made it happen. Was not nobody manipulating her. She manipulated all of us." The minister who performed the marriage traveled from Philadelphia to testify. He described his conversation with Violet before the ceremony, her clear articulation of her intentions, her understanding of the legal and social implications. He stated unequivocally that she was a willing participant, acting with full mental capacity. But the most powerful testimony came from Daniel himself. Pemberton called him to the stand on February 23, 1853. It was extraordinary for an enslaved person to testify in a Virginia court, even one who was technically free under the disputed will. The courtroom was silent as Daniel took the oath. Pemberton led Daniel through his history, his birth in Caroline County, his arrival at Willowbrook, his relationship with Violet over 12 years. Daniel spoke carefully, knowing every word could be used to justify voiding the will. He described how Violet had encouraged him to read, had engaged him in intellectual conversation, had treated him with respect, unusual for an enslaved person. He acknowledged that their relationship had deepened over years, that feelings had developed that neither intended. He explained that the marriage had been Violet's idea, that she had planned it, that he had initially resisted because he saw all the ways it could fail. "Why did you finally agree?" Pemberton asked. "Because she offered me the possibility of freedom, not just for myself but for everyone at Willowbrook. Because she was dying and wanted to use her death to create something good from the evil she had participated in, and because I loved her." The courtroom reacted loudly to this admission. Judge Crawford called for order. When silence returned, Pemberton continued. "Did you manipulate her? Did you take advantage of her illness?" "No, sir. Mrs. Violet was the strongest person I ever knew. She made all the decisions. I followed her lead. If anyone was manipulated, it was me. Manipulated into hoping that freedom was possible, that this system could be fought from within." Wickham's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Daniel's character, his intelligence, his presumption in thinking he could marry a white woman. He suggested Daniel had deliberately seduced Violet, had created emotional dependence, had exploited her physical weakness. Daniel responded to each attack with quiet dignity. Yes, he had encouraged Violet's dependence on his company, but she had encouraged his dependence equally. Yes, he had participated in planning the marriage, but only after Violet insisted repeatedly. Yes, he stood to gain tremendously from her death, but so did her legitimate heirs, and no one questioned their love for her. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Both sides presented extensive evidence and arguments. The legal questions were genuinely complex. Did federal comity require Virginia to recognize an interracial marriage performed legally in Pennsylvania? Could such a marriage be valid if one party had previously owned the other? Did Violet have the legal right to leave her estate to anyone she chose, even if that choice violated social norms? Judge Crawford took 2 weeks to render his decision. On March 21, 1853, he read his ruling in a crowded courtroom. He found that the marriage was legally valid under Pennsylvania law. that Virginia was required to recognize it under federal comity principles. That Violet had been mentally competent when she wrote her will and married Daniel. That there was insufficient evidence of undue influence or fraud. Therefore, the will would stand. Daniel Freeman was the legal owner of Willowbrook Plantation and all its assets. The Harrington family's challenge was denied. The courtroom erupted. Nathaniel Harrington screamed that justice had been perverted. Randolph stormed out, vowing to appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court. Other family members wept or raged, but Judge Crawford had made his ruling, and legally it stood. Daniel sat quietly through the chaos, processing that he had actually won. That Violet's plan had worked, that he now owned a plantation and over 100 enslaved people, and had the legal authority to begin freeing them all. The Harrington family did appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court. The appeal was heard in July of 1853. The higher court affirmed Judge Crawford's ruling in December of 1853, finding no legal error in his decision. The marriage was valid. The will would stand. Daniel Freeman was the legal owner of Willowbrook Plantation. But winning the legal battle did not end the war. The Harrington family began a campaign of social and economic pressure designed to force Daniel to give up the property. They convinced other planters not to do business with him. They spread rumors that he had murdered Violet. They suggested to enslaved people at Willowbrook that Daniel's promises of freedom were lies designed to keep them compliant. More dangerously, there were threats of violence. Daniel received multiple warnings that he would be killed if he did not leave Virginia. Several times, armed men appeared at Willowbrook at night, apparently intending to attack. Daniel organized defense with freedmen from the property, creating patrols and watch systems. Despite these challenges, Daniel began the process of manumission. Virginia law required that freed slaves leave the state within 12 months, unless they received special permission to remain. Daniel began filing manumission papers for individuals and families, coordinating with Underground Railroad networks to help those who wanted to go north, and petitioning the legislature for permission for those who wanted to stay. The process was slow and expensive. Each manumission required legal documentation, fees, and often bribes to officials who resented a black man controlling such wealth. But Daniel persisted. By the end of 1854, he had freed 37 people. By the end of 1855, another 41 were free. He was methodically dismantling the slave labor force that had built Willowbrook's wealth. He also began recruiting paid laborers to work the tobacco fields. Free black people, poor whites, immigrants willing to work for wages rather than submit to slavery. It was not easy. Most workers were suspicious of a black landowner. Many quit when they encountered hostility from neighboring planters. But Daniel gradually built a workforce that allowed him to keep operating the plantation while continuing manumissions. In 1856, Daniel sold half the plantation land to a group of Pennsylvania Quakers who wanted to establish a free black farming community in Virginia. The sale brought $60,000, which Daniel used to fund continued manumissions and to purchase property in Ohio, where freed Willowbrook residents could relocate and establish farms. The Virginia planter class watched all of this with horror. Daniel was demonstrating that enslaved labor was not economically necessary, that free black people could farm successfully, that the entire system could be dismantled if people chose to do so. He represented an existential threat to their society, and they wanted him destroyed. In 1857, the Virginia legislature passed a law specifically targeting Daniel's situation. The law stated that no person who had been enslaved in Virginia could own slaves in Virginia, even if they had been freed. Any property ownership that included enslaved people must be sold within 6 months, with proceeds going to the estate of the former owner's heirs. The law was clearly unconstitutional and clearly aimed at Daniel alone. Pemberton filed immediate legal challenges, but the law created uncertainty that slowed Daniel's manumission efforts. Some free people chose to leave immediately rather than risk being re-enslaved if the law stood. Others stayed, trusting Daniel to fight it. The legal battle over the law went to federal court, where judges ruled in 1858 that Virginia could not retroactively void property transfers or target specific individuals with punitive legislation. The law was struck down, but the damage was done. Daniel had lost a year, had seen his community scattered, had spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal defense. By 1859, Daniel had freed 93 of the original 117 enslaved people. The remaining 24 were in process, awaiting paperwork or choosing to stay voluntarily as paid workers until they decided where to go. Willowbrook Plantation was transforming. The remaining operation was smaller, based on paid labor, producing modest profits that Daniel used to support freed people and fund abolitionist causes. The main house, where Daniel now lived, had become a station on the Underground Railroad, hiding fugitives and helping them reach northern states. Daniel himself had become a symbol. Abolitionists celebrated him as proof that enslaved people could thrive when given opportunity. Slaveholders despised him as a dangerous example of what would happen if their system was challenged. He received invitations to speak in northern cities, which he declined, believing his presence in Virginia was more important. He received death threats weekly, which he took seriously but did not let stop his work. In April of 1860, Daniel married again. A free black woman named Grace Hammond, daughter of freed people from Maryland, who had come to Virginia specifically to work with Daniel. Their marriage was public, legal in Virginia because both were free, and celebrated by the freed Willowbrook community. They were both 38 years old. They had found each other through shared commitment to destroying slavery from within. When the Civil War began in April of 1861, Daniel immediately offered Willowbrook as a resource for the Union cause. He provided food, supplies, and refuge for escaped slaves. He recruited freed men to serve as scouts and guides for Union forces. When the war finally ended in April of 1865, with slavery abolished throughout the nation, Daniel had already freed everyone at Willowbrook. His work simply continued under a new legal framework. In 1868, Randolph Harrington, who had never accepted the loss of his family's plantation, made one final attempt to reclaim Willowbrook. He sued Daniel, claiming that even though the original will stood, Daniel should be required to compensate the heirs for the property value they had lost. The suit was dismissed immediately. The war had changed everything. Virginia courts were now under Reconstruction authority. Black landowners were protected by federal law. Randolph had no standing and no chance. Daniel lived until 1891, dying at age 69 of natural causes. He had spent 40 years as a free man, 39 of those years as a landowner and community leader. He and Grace had 6 children, all born free, all educated, all becoming teachers, ministers, and business owners in Virginia's free black community. Willowbrook Plantation was divided among their children when Daniel died. The land that had been worked by enslaved labor for over 100 years became the foundation for a free black farming community that thrived into the 20th century. The main house was converted into a school for black children in 1896. The Harrington family never recovered from the scandal. Nathaniel died in 1863, bitter and bankrupt. Randolph moved to Texas after the war and died in 1879 without having spoken to his sister Lydia in 20 years. Lydia, who had always been more perceptive than her brother, made peace with what her mother had done. She visited Willowbrook once in 1870, meeting Daniel, seeing what the plantation had become. She told him she understood now what her mother had been trying to accomplish, that she wished she had supported it rather than remaining silent. In 1937, a historian researching Reconstruction in Virginia discovered the court records of Harrington versus Freeman and the extraordinary story behind them. She interviewed Daniel's surviving children and grandchildren, gathered documents, and published an article describing what she called the most remarkable case of resistance to slavery from within the system. The article brought renewed attention to Violet and Daniel's story. Some historians celebrated it as brilliant strategic resistance. Others criticized it as too individualistic, arguing that it did not challenge the system broadly enough. Some questioned whether a relationship between an enslaved person and their owner could ever be truly consensual, regardless of later marriage. These debates continued through the 20th century and into the 21st. The story raises uncomfortable questions about power, consent, resistance, and the moral compromises required to survive in evil systems. There are no simple answers. What is clear is that Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman took extraordinary risks to create something unprecedented. That their marriage, however complicated its origins, resulted in freedom for over 100 people. That Daniel used inherited wealth to establish a thriving free black community in Virginia. That their story challenges simplistic narratives about slavery, race, and resistance. The Willowbrook School, established in the former plantation house, operated until 1968, when integration led to consolidation with other schools. The building was demolished in 1975. Some of the plantation land remains in the hands of Daniel's descendants. Other portions were sold over the years. Nothing visible remains of the quarters where enslaved people lived, or the fields they worked. But the story persists. Passed down through generations of Daniel's descendants, documented in court records, studied by historians. A reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, people found ways to resist. That love could exist in impossible circumstances. That the powerful sometimes chose justice over maintaining their power. And that one woman's death created freedom for many people's lives. This mystery shows us that inheritance is not just about property, but about legacy. That resistance to slavery took many forms, some conventional and some unprecedented. That relationships between enslaved and free people were more complex than simple oppression and submission. And that documents sealed for centuries sometimes reveal stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about how change happens. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Violet and Daniel's relationship could have been genuinely consensual given the power dynamics? Do you think Daniel's inheritance and use of it justified the means by which he obtained it? Do you think Violet deserves credit for trying to make amends for slaveholding, or criticism for having participated in it for so long? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this complex chapter in Virginia history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Whispers and Frames. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that explore the complicated intersections of love, power, justice, and resistance in America's past. Remember, the truth is often more complex than it first appears, and history holds stories that defy our expectations about what was possible, even in the darkest times. See you in the next video.
On the morning of March 15th, 1854, a physician named Dr. William Ashford rode his carriage through the iron gates of Magnolia Grove Plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, expecting to attend to his usual patient, the plantation's aging mistress who suffered from persistent respiratory ailments. What he encountered instead would become the most perplexing medical case of his 30-year career. One that he would document in private journals never intended for publication. One that would haunt his professional reputation and challenge everything he believed about the limitations of the human body. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the bottomlands along the Yazoo River when Dr. Ashford's carriage turned onto the oak-lined drive that led to Magnolia Grove's main house. Spanish moss hung from the ancient trees like tattered shrouds, filtering the pale morning light into something gray and uncertain. The air carried the heavy sweetness of early spring in Mississippi. Magnolia blossoms, mixing with the darker scent of turned earth from fields being prepared for cotton planting. Dr. Ashford had traveled this road hundreds of times over the years, attending to the various ailments of the Wade family and occasionally to injured or seriously ill enslaved workers whose value justified medical intervention. He knew every curve, every gate, every landmark between his practice in Vicksburg and this prosperous plantation that represented everything the antebellum South aspired to become. Nothing about the morning suggested that he was riding toward an encounter that would overturn his understanding of human biology. Nothing prepared him for the impossibility he would witness before the day was through. The summons had been urgent, delivered by a young enslaved boy who had ridden 3 miles through the pre-dawn darkness with nothing but a scrawled note from the plantation's overseer. The note contained only 7 words that made no medical sense. Old Hattie having birth pains. Come quick. Dr. Ashford had initially assumed the message contained an error. Perhaps the overseer meant to write that Old Hattie was attending a birth, as she had served as the plantation's midwife for decades. But when he arrived at Magnolia Grove and was led not to the main house, but to the slave quarters behind the kitchen garden, he found a scene that defied explanation. Hattie Crawford lay on a narrow wooden bed in a cabin she had occupied for nearly 60 years. Her face was deeply lined, her hair completely white, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her belly, exposed as 2 younger enslaved women attempted to ease her obvious discomfort, showed the unmistakable distension of advanced pregnancy. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute, unable to reconcile what his eyes were showing him with what his medical training insisted was impossible. The cabin itself bore witness to a lifetime of captivity. Its walls were rough-hewn timber, darkened by decades of smoke from the small fireplace that provided the only heat in winter. A wooden crucifix hung above the bed, carved by skilled hands from local Cyprus. Its Christ figure worn smooth by years of reverent touching. On a small shelf near the single window sat three objects of obvious personal significance: a chipped ceramic bowl painted with blue flowers, a piece of quartz crystal worn smooth as if handled constantly over many years, and a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth that Dr. Ashford would later learn contained a lock of hair from each of Hattie's 11 children, collected before they were sold away to fates she would never know. The two women attending Hattie moved with practiced efficiency, but their faces showed the same confusion that Dr. Ashford felt. One was mopping Hattie's brow with a damp cloth, while the other prepared a basin of warm water for what they assumed would be necessary. Neither spoke as the doctor entered, but their eyes asked the questions their voices could not. Is this possible? How can this be happening? What are we supposed to do now? Hattie herself seemed beyond concern about impossibilities. Her eyes were closed, her breathing deep and rhythmic in the pattern of a woman who had given birth many times before, and knew how to manage the pain through practiced technique. Whatever supernatural explanation might eventually be offered for her condition, in this moment she was simply a woman doing what countless women had done before her, enduring the ancient agony of bringing new life into the world. This woman, according to the plantation records he would later examine, had been born in 1782 on a tobacco farm in Virginia. She had been sold 3 times before arriving at Magnolia Grove in 1809 as part of a lot purchase that included her mother, her aunt, and 7 other enslaved people. She had given birth to 11 children during her fertile years, the last in 1823. When she was 41 years old, that child, a daughter named Pearl, had been sold away in 1831 and never seen again. Dr. Ashford would spend weeks after this day researching Hattie's history, driven by a professional need to understand what he had witnessed. He obtained access to bills of sale, plantation ledgers, and the testimony of elderly enslaved people who remembered her arrival at Magnolia Grove as a young woman. The picture that emerged was of a life marked by extraordinary endurance and repeated loss. Hattie's mother, a woman named Clara, had been born in Africa, captured as a young girl, and transported across the Atlantic in conditions that killed half of those who made the crossing with her. Clara had never fully mastered English, communicating in a mixture of her native tongue and broken phrases that her children learned to understand through necessity. She had passed to Hattie certain traditions and beliefs, herbal knowledge and spiritual practices that blended African traditions with the Christianity that slaveholders imposed on their human property. Clara died in 1817, worn out by decades of labor, and was buried in the unmarked corner of Magnolia Grove, where enslaved people were interred without ceremony or memorial. Hattie's 11 children had come over a span of 22 years, their fathers a mixture of enslaved men she had chosen when choice was possible, and white men whose attentions she could not refuse. The first, a son named Jacob, was sold when he was 12 years old to pay debts incurred by a previous owner. The second and third, twin girls named Ruth and Rebecca, survived only to age 5 before fever claimed them both in a single terrible week. The 4th through 9th children, 4 boys and 2 girls, grew to working age and were sold at various times between 1815 and 1828 to buyers from Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. The 10th child, a boy named Samuel, had been beaten to death by an overseer in 1826 for refusing to whip another enslaved man. And Pearl, the 11th and last, beautiful and defiant at 15 years old, had been sold specifically because the young Cornelius Wade, then recently widowed and recently married to his second wife, had shown too obvious an interest in her. Hattie had mourned each loss in the only way available to her, by continuing to exist, by performing the labor required of her, by keeping alive whatever memories she could hold in a heart that had been broken and healed and broken again more times than any heart should have to endure. She had long since accepted that motherhood for an enslaved woman meant creating life only to watch it taken away, building love only to have it sold to strangers who would use and abuse, and eventually discard the precious souls she had carried and nursed and tried to protect. Now, 31 years after her last pregnancy, at an age when most women had been past childbearing for a quarter century, Hattie Crawford was in active labor, and the child she carried, as Dr. Ashford would eventually confirm through careful examination and the testimony of witnesses he interviewed in the weeks that followed, belonged to the man who owned her, 68-year-old Cornelius Wade, the patriarch of Magnolia Grove, and one of the wealthiest planters in Warren County. Welcome to Whispers in Frames, where we uncover the forgotten stories that mainstream history tried to bury. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is a documented account, pieced together from medical records, plantation ledgers, court testimonies, and private correspondence discovered in archives across Mississippi and Louisiana. The story of Hattie Crawford challenges everything we think we know about age, fertility, power, and the unspeakable intimacies that existed within the institution of slavery. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another dark chapter of American history. Now, let us return to that cabin in 1854, where an impossible birth was about to reshape the future of an entire dynasty. Cornelius Wade had built Magnolia Grove from nothing. His father, a failed shopkeeper from Charleston, had died penniless in 1802, leaving behind a widow and 3 children with no prospects. Cornelius, the eldest at 14, had worked on the docks of New Orleans for 3 years, saving every cent until he could purchase 50 acres of untamed Mississippi land in 1805. By 1820, through a combination of ruthless business practices, strategic marriages, and the systematic exploitation of enslaved labor, he controlled over 4,000 acres and owned 118 human beings. The young Cornelius had arrived in Mississippi during the Great Land Rush that followed the Louisiana Purchase and the defeat of Native American resistance in the region. He had been hardened by years of brutal dock work, scarred by childhood poverty, and utterly determined to become the kind of man his father had failed to be. He had no education beyond basic literacy and arithmetic, but he possessed a natural cunning for business and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to accumulate wealth and power. His first land purchase had been a swampy tract that other settlers considered worthless, infested with mosquitoes and subject to flooding during the wet season. But Cornelius had recognized the potential of the rich alluvial soil beneath the standing water. He had spent 3 years draining the land with the labor of 5 enslaved people he had acquired through a combination of purchase and trade, working alongside them in the brutal conditions until the mosquito-borne fevers nearly killed him twice. When the land was finally ready for cultivation, he planted cotton and watched it grow tall and heavy with the white gold that was making Mississippi planters wealthy beyond imagination. By the time he married Elizabeth Thornton in 1812, Cornelius had already earned a reputation as one of Warren County's most ruthless and successful young planters. Elizabeth brought connections to established Natchez society and a modest dowry that Cornelius immediately invested in more land and more enslaved people. She was a quiet, pious woman who accepted her husband's frequent absences and obvious liaisons with enslaved women as the unfortunate but unavoidable behavior of men of his class. She bore him 2 sons, William in 1813 and Robert in 1814. Before dying of childbed fever with their 3rd pregnancy, Cornelius mourned Elizabeth for exactly 6 months before beginning his courtship of Margaret Collins, the daughter of a prominent Vicksburg merchant whose business connections promised access to credit and markets that would fund the next phase of Magnolia Grove's expansion. Margaret was more spirited than Elizabeth had been, more demanding of her husband's attention, more willing to challenge his authority in domestic matters. Their marriage was stormy but productive, yielding 3 daughters and a son over 11 years before yellow fever swept through the region in 1836 and claimed Margaret, along with dozens of others. It was during his second widowhood that Cornelius's relationship with Hattie Crawford became something more than the casual exploitation that characterized most interactions between masters and enslaved women. The exact circumstances of its evolution remain unclear, lost in the silence that both parties maintained throughout the decades that followed. But witnesses from that period, enslaved people whose testimony was recorded after the war, spoke of a connection that seemed to transcend the brutal inequalities of their positions. Cornelius visited Hattie's cabin not just for physical satisfaction but for conversation, for company, for something that might, in any other context, have been called companionship. His first wife, Elizabeth Thornton, had given him 2 sons before dying of childbed fever in 1814. His second wife, Margaret Collins, bore him 3 daughters and a third son before succumbing to yellow fever in 1836. His third wife, Caroline Beaumont, was 32 years his junior when they married in 1840. She had produced no children despite 14 years of marriage, a failure that had become the subject of whispered speculation throughout Warren County society. Caroline, now 46, had long since accepted her barrenness as God's judgment, though for what sin she could not say. She managed the household with cold efficiency, overseeing the domestic slaves with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. She attended church every Sunday, hosted the proper social gatherings, and maintained the appearance of a respectable planter's wife. But her position in the Wade family hierarchy had grown increasingly precarious as the years passed without an heir from her womb. Cornelius Wade's surviving children from his previous marriages had scattered like seeds in hostile soil. His eldest son, William, had died in a duel over a gambling debt in 1842. His second son, Robert, had moved to Texas in 1845 and severed contact with the family after a dispute over inheritance. His 3 daughters had all married and moved away, their loyalties now belonging to their husbands' families. His youngest son, Thomas, had drowned in the Mississippi River in 1851 at the age of 23, leaving Cornelius without a male heir to inherit Magnolia Grove. This was the situation that existed when Dr. Ashford entered Hattie Crawford's cabin on that March morning. The plantation's future hung in legal uncertainty. Cornelius Wade's health was failing, his heart weakened by decades of excess, his mind occasionally wandering into confusion. His wife controlled much of the daily operations but had no legal claim to the property. His surviving daughters were already maneuvering through their husbands to claim portions of the estate. And somewhere in the legal machinery of Mississippi's inheritance laws, the enslaved people of Magnolia Grove faced the very real possibility of being sold and scattered to settle debts and satisfy competing claims. But now, in this cramped cabin that smelled of wood smoke and sweat and the iron tang of approaching birth, everything was about to change. Dr. Ashford knelt beside the bed and conducted the examination that would confirm what everyone already suspected. Hattie Crawford was fully dilated. The baby was positioned correctly. Despite her advanced age and the apparent impossibility of her condition, she was about to give birth. "How is this possible?" Dr. Ashford asked, more to himself than to anyone present. "I have attended hundreds of births. I have studied the medical literature. Women simply do not conceive at 71 years of age. It defies natural law." One of the younger women attending Hattie, a woman named Dinah who served as the plantation's current midwife, met the doctor's eyes with an expression that contained layers of meaning he could not fully interpret. "Lots of things happen on this plantation that defy natural law, Doctor. Some things best not to question too deeply." The labor continued for 7 more hours. Dr. Ashford, despite his initial shock, performed his professional duties with the competence that had made him the most sought-after physician in Warren County. He monitored Hattie's vital signs, which remained surprisingly stable despite her age. He administered small doses of laudanum to ease her pain, though Hattie refused more than minimal relief, insisting she wanted to be fully present for what she clearly believed would be her final act of creation. He prepared for the complications he expected: hemorrhaging, cardiac failure, obstructed delivery, but none materialized. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Hattie Crawford delivered a healthy boy. The child weighed 7 pounds and 3 ounces, cried lustily when Dr. Ashford cleared his airways, and showed no signs of the defects or weaknesses that might be expected from such an elderly mother. His skin was considerably lighter than Hattie's, his features a blend of African and European characteristics that left no doubt about his mixed parentage. His eyes, when they opened, were the same pale blue that had marked every Wade male for 3 generations. Dr. Ashford held the infant in trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. In his decades of medical practice, he had attended births in circumstances ranging from elegant bedrooms in Natchez mansions to crude cabins on the frontier, where women labored alone except for whatever help neighbors could provide. He had seen miraculous survivals and heartbreaking losses, had welcomed healthy children into the world, and had sadly recorded the deaths of mothers and babies when complications proved insurmountable. But he had never witnessed anything like this. A birth that should have been impossible according to every principle of medical science, yet had proceeded with the normalcy of any other delivery he had attended. The baby, once cleaned and swaddled by the attending women, was placed in Hattie's arms. Despite her exhaustion, despite the ordeal she had just endured at an age when most women struggled simply to survive from day to day, Hattie's face transformed with an expression that Dr. Ashford would remember for the rest of his life. It was joy, unmistakably, the pure and uncomplicated joy of a mother meeting her child for the first time. But beneath the joy was something else, something that might have been called recognition or perhaps anticipation, as if this moment was one she had been waiting for without knowing that she waited. She held the baby with practiced ease, positioning him for nursing with the automatic competence of a woman who had performed this action 11 times before. The infant latched without difficulty, his small hands pressing against her skin, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity unusual in a newborn. The room fell silent as mother and child completed the ancient ritual of first feeding, the attending women watching with tears streaming down their faces. Dr. Ashford standing frozen by the doorway, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary experience. When Cornelius Wade was informed of the birth, he was sitting in his study reviewing quarterly production reports with his overseer, a hard man named Samuel Jennings, who had managed Magnolia Grove's workforce for 15 years. According to Jennings' later account, given during legal proceedings that would consume the following 2 years, Wade received the news with no visible emotion. He set down his pen, folded his hands on the desk, and sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes before speaking. "The child will be named Marcus. He will be raised in the house. See that appropriate arrangements are made." Jennings had been aware of Wade's relationship with Hattie Crawford. Everyone on the plantation knew, though no one spoke of it openly. It had begun decades earlier, during Wade's first widowhood, and had continued sporadically through his subsequent marriages. Hattie had been young then, perhaps 30 years old when the relationship first began, considered beautiful among the enslaved population, skilled in domestic work, and possessed of a quiet dignity that had apparently attracted the young widower's attention. But the continuation of such a relationship with a woman in her 70s, and the resulting pregnancy, suggested something beyond mere physical attraction. It suggested a connection that had endured for nearly 4 decades, outlasting 2 wives and countless other liaisons that were common practice among men of Wade's position. Jennings had heard rumors of Wade visiting Hattie's cabin late at night even in recent years, but he had dismissed them as impossible the kind of salacious gossip that enslaved people invented to make sense of their circumstances. The baby's existence proved those rumors had been true all along. Caroline Wade's reaction to the news was considerably more dramatic. According to testimony later provided by household servants, she received the information while taking tea in the parlor with two visiting neighbors, Mrs. Adelaide Forsyth and Mrs. Helena Blackwood, both prominent members of Warren County society. Caroline's face drained of color. Her teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, and she excused herself with a murmured apology before retreating to her private chambers, where she remained for the next 3 days, refusing food and admitting no visitors except her personal maid. The visiting ladies departed shortly after Caroline's withdrawal, their carriage barely out of sight, before they began composing the letters that would spread news of the scandal throughout Warren County's social network. By the following morning, every respectable household within 20 miles knew that Cornelius Wade had fathered a child with a 72-year-old slave, a fact so extraordinary that many initially dismissed it as malicious gossip before the details were confirmed by multiple sources. Caroline herself spent those 3 days in a state of barely controlled rage. The servants who occasionally glimpsed her through briefly opened doors reported that she alternated between periods of furious pacing and utter stillness, between fits of weeping and extended silences during which she sat motionless before her writing desk, covering page after page with correspondence that she sealed with her personal cipher. Her personal maid, a young enslaved woman named Sarah who had served Caroline since childhood, later testified that her mistress's mood during those days was the darkest she had ever witnessed, a cold fury that seemed to fill the room with its presence. What she did during those 3 days would not become clear until later, but it involved extensive letter writing to her husband's surviving daughters and their husbands, consultations with a lawyer from Vicksburg who arrived by private carriage on the second day, and careful examination of every legal document she could access in the plantation's records room. Caroline Wade was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and she immediately recognized the threat that this child posed to whatever inheritance she might claim when her husband died. The lawyer, a man named Beauregard Sinclair, who specialized in estate matters and had represented several prominent families in contentious inheritance disputes, spent 6 hours closeted with Caroline in the plantation's study. The enslaved house servants who brought refreshments during this meeting heard fragments of conversation that suggested Caroline was exploring every possible avenue for protecting her interests. They heard legal terms they did not understand, discussions of precedent and statute, references to cases from other states where similar situations had arisen. They heard Caroline's voice, normally controlled and modulated, rising occasionally in frustration or emphasis, and they heard Sinclair's measured responses, the careful language of a man who was being paid handsomely to find solutions to problems that ordinary law could not easily address. The first week following the birth established patterns that would persist throughout the strange months that followed. Hattie was moved from her cabin to a small room adjacent to the kitchen in the main house, ostensibly so that the baby could be closer to wet nurses among the household slaves, but actually so that Cornelius could visit more easily without crossing the grounds to the slave quarters. The child thrived under the care of multiple women who attended him in shifts, growing visibly stronger each day, despite the seemingly impossible circumstances of his conception and birth. Dr. Ashford visited daily for the first 2 weeks, documenting Hattie's recovery with meticulous attention to detail. His medical journals from this period, discovered among his papers after his death in 1873, reveal a physician struggling to reconcile his observations with his training. Her constitution is remarkable for any woman, let alone one of her advanced years. He wrote on March 22nd, "The birth produced none of the complications I anticipated. Her uterus has contracted normally. Her bleeding ceased within expected parameters. Her strength returns daily. I find myself questioning whether the age recorded in plantation documents might be an error, but multiple sources confirm she was indeed born in 1782. I am witnessing something that should not be medically possible. Yet the evidence is undeniable. The enslaved community at Magnolia Grove received the news of Hattie's child with a complex mixture of emotions that outsiders would have struggled to understand. On one level, the birth represented yet another violation, another instance of their master exercising power over a woman's body, another mixed-race child whose existence testified to the intimate brutalities of the system that imprisoned them all. Many of the older enslaved people remembered Hattie's previous children, remembered watching them grow and then disappear, sold away when they became old enough to be valuable. Their fates unknown, their mother's grief absorbed into the endless work that filled every day. The quarters buzzed with whispered conversations in the days following the birth. In the kitchen where house servants prepared meals, in the fields where cotton workers took their brief rest breaks, in the cabins where families gathered after the day's labor was complete, people spoke in low voices about what had happened and what it might mean. Some conversations were purely practical, speculating about how the baby's presence might affect the plantation's operations, whether the master's attention would be distracted from the normal demands of management, whether Caroline Wade's obvious fury might lead to punishments that fell on the enslaved population as displaced anger often did. Other conversations ventured into territory that was more dangerous to discuss openly. Some of the younger enslaved people, those who had not yet had their spirits entirely crushed by the system, wondered aloud whether Marcus's existence might somehow become a weapon against the family that owned them all. If Cornelius acknowledged this child, if he attempted to provide for him, the resulting family conflict might create opportunities that could be exploited. Division among the masters had sometimes led to improved conditions for the enslaved, or at least to the distraction that made small rebellions possible. But there was also something else in their reaction, something that might be called awe, or perhaps a form of hope. Hattie had survived. She had endured 60 years of bondage on this plantation, had outlived two of the mistresses who had held power over her daily existence, had reached an age that few enslaved people ever saw, and now, at the end of her life, she had produced one more child. Some saw this as a final act of defiance, a demonstration that the essential creative power of life could not be fully controlled even by the most comprehensive system of domination. Others interpreted it through religious frameworks, seeing divine intervention or perhaps judgment in such an unusual birth. Among the women of the quarters, the birth sparked discussions about the mysterious workings of the body, about herbs and practices that were said to affect fertility, about old stories passed down from African ancestors that spoke of women who conceived children at impossible ages as signs of spiritual favor or prophetic significance. These conversations happened in spaces where no white person would overhear, in the late evening hours when the cabins became havens of relative privacy, in the fields where the rhythm of work provided cover for whispered exchanges. The knowledge being shared was older than slavery itself, carried across the ocean in the memories of captured women who had refused to let the Middle Passage erase everything they knew about life and death and the powers that moved between them. An elderly man named Solomon, who worked in the stables and was known among the enslaved community as a keeper of oral traditions and spiritual wisdom, offered his interpretation during a gathering in the quarters on the Sunday following the birth. "God done sent a sign," he said to the assembled group. "Old Hattie been serving this family since before most of us was born. She done gave them 11 children already, 11 souls pulled from her body and sold away like so much livestock. And now, at the end of her days, she give them one more. But this one different. This one gonna live in the big house. This one gonna have that Wade blood showing plain in his face. This one gonna be there when the old master dies, looking just like him, reminding everybody what really happened here all these years." Solomon's words carried weight because he was believed to possess spiritual sight, the ability to perceive truths that remained hidden from ordinary eyes. People came to him with dreams they needed interpreted, with questions about the future they were afraid to ask anyone else. with problems that seemed to have no solutions in the material world. His pronouncement about Marcus was taken as prophecy by many who heard it. A prediction that this child would somehow disrupt the established order, even if no one could say exactly how. Others were more skeptical. A woman named Martha, who worked in the weaving house and was known for her practical wisdom and sharp tongue, offered a different perspective. "That baby gonna be sold just like all the rest," she said to a group of younger women who had gathered around her workstation. "Master Wade might think he feels something special right now, but feelings don't change laws and they don't change what white folks believe about us. That boy got Wade eyes, but he got Hattie's blood too. And blood is what matters in this world. When the old man dies, Miss Caroline gonna sell that baby so fast his head spin. Mark my words." Both perspectives would prove partially correct in the months and years that followed. Marcus would indeed become a focal point for conflict within the Wade family, and the legal system would indeed prove resistant to Cornelius's attempts to change his son's status. But neither Solomon nor Martha could have predicted the specific twists and turns that fate had in store for the infant whose birth had disrupted the uneasy equilibrium of Magnolia Grove. The legal implications of Marcus's birth became apparent within weeks. Under Mississippi law in 1854, the child of an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. This was the principle of partus sequitur ventrem, established in colonial Virginia and adopted throughout the slave-holding states, which ensured that the children of enslaved mothers would add to their owner's human property, regardless of paternity. Marcus, despite his Wade blood, was legally Cornelius Wade's property, not his heir. But Cornelius Wade had other ideas. In late April, he summoned his lawyer, a man named Theodore Carlyle from Vicksburg, to Magnolia Grove for an extended consultation. The purpose, which would become clear in the documents Carlyle later filed with the Warren County Court, was to explore every legal mechanism by which Marcus might be freed and legitimized. The obstacles were formidable. Mississippi law prohibited the freeing of enslaved people, except by specific legislative act or by removing them from the state. Even if Marcus could be legally freed, he could not inherit property as the illegitimate son of a white man and an enslaved woman. The entire legal structure of antebellum Mississippi was designed to prevent exactly what Cornelius Wade was attempting: the recognition of a mixed-race child as a legitimate heir with claims to a white man's estate. Carlyle, a pragmatic man who had built his practice on finding creative solutions to difficult legal problems, proposed a series of steps that might, if executed carefully over several years, accomplish Wade's goals. The first step involved petitioning the Mississippi legislature for a private bill authorizing Marcus's emancipation, citing the child's white paternity and Wade's desire to provide for his son. Such bills were occasionally granted, though the process was politically fraught and success was far from guaranteed. The second step, assuming emancipation could be obtained, involved transferring Marcus to a free state, likely Ohio or Pennsylvania, where he could be educated and eventually established in a profession. The third step, the most legally complex, involved restructuring Wade's estate so that assets could flow to Marcus indirectly through a trust administered by sympathetic parties, bypassing the restrictions on direct inheritance by illegitimate children of color. Caroline Wade learned of these plans through her own network of informants, household servants, whose loyalties she had cultivated through small favors and veiled threats over the years. Her response was swift and calculated. She began her own correspondence with her husband's surviving daughters, laying the groundwork for a legal challenge to any modification of the estate. She compiled documentation of her husband's declining mental faculties, collecting statements from neighbors and business associates who had noticed his occasional confusion and memory lapses. She prepared for a war of attrition that she was determined to win. Meanwhile, in the small room adjacent to the kitchen, Hattie Crawford nursed her infant son and waited for whatever would come next. She had lived long enough to abandon any illusions about her own agency in the dramas that swirled around her. She had been property for 72 years, her body used and her children taken at the whim of owners who saw her as a valuable asset rather than a human being with her own desires and rights. She had loved some of the children who had been sold away, had been indifferent to others, had survived their loss the same way she survived everything else. By continuing to exist, by doing the work required of her, by keeping whatever remained of her true self hidden in places no master could reach. But this child felt different. Perhaps it was her age. The knowledge that she would not survive many more years, that this would be her final opportunity to nurture a life she had created. Perhaps it was something about Marcus himself, the way his eyes focused on her face with unusual intensity for a newborn, the strength of his grip when he clutched her finger, the fierce determination in his cry when he was hungry. Or perhaps it was something about Cornelius Wade's reaction, the unprecedented decision to acknowledge this child, to give him a name, to speak of him with a tenderness that Hattie had never witnessed in nearly 4 decades of intimate acquaintance with the man who owned her. Whatever the reason, Hattie found herself hoping for the first time in years, not hoping for freedom, which seemed too abstract to imagine after so many decades of bondage, not hoping for justice, which had never existed for people like her in this world, but hoping that this child might somehow escape the fate that had claimed all of Dei, his siblings, that he might grow up to know something better than what she had known, that her final act of creation might produce something that would outlast the system that had consumed her life. The summer of 1854 brought escalating tensions to Magnolia Grove. Cornelius Wade's health declined noticeably, his heart condition worsening despite Dr. Ashford's treatments. He spent increasingly long hours with the infant Marcus, sitting in the nursery room while Hattie fed and cared for the child, sometimes holding the baby himself with a tenderness that seemed incongruous with everything else known about his character. He began dictating letters to his lawyer almost daily, each one adding new provisions to the complex legal structure he was attempting to construct. Caroline Wade watched these developments with cold fury. Her letters to her stepdaughters grew more urgent, her consultations with her own legal advisors more frequent. She began documenting every instance of her husband's apparent mental confusion, every moment when he seemed unable to remember names or dates, every decision that seemed irrational from a business perspective. She was building a case for incompetence, preparing to challenge whatever arrangements he made as the products of a deteriorating mind. The enslaved community observed these power struggles with the cynical awareness of people who understood that their fates would be determined by forces entirely beyond their control. Some hoped that Marcus's existence might somehow benefit them, that a master with a mixed-race son might develop a conscience about the system that made such children possible. Others expected nothing good to come from the situation, predicting that Marcus would be sold away like all of Hattie's other children once the novelty wore off, or once Cornelius died and Caroline gained control. The overseer, Samuel Jennings, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His authority derived from Cornelius Wade. But Caroline was gaining influence as her husband weakened. He had to maintain relationships with both, while keeping the plantation productive and the enslaved workforce under control. He dealt with the situation by pretending it did not exist, refusing to discuss Hattie or Marcus with anyone, deflecting questions with gruff dismissals, and focusing obsessively on cotton production and maintenance schedules. In July, the first direct confrontation occurred between Caroline and Cornelius over the baby's future. The argument took place in the parlor after dinner, and although the household servants who witnessed it were careful not to appear too interested, they heard every word through the thin walls and open windows that provided the only relief from the Mississippi summer heat. "You are making yourself ridiculous," Caroline said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The entire county is talking about you and that ancient slave woman. Do you have any idea what people are saying in Vicksburg. In Natchez. Your daughters are mortified. Your business associates are questioning your judgment. And now you propose to elevate this bastard child above your legitimate family? Cornelius's response was measured but firm. Marcus is my son. He carries my blood as surely as any of the children my wives bore me. The fact that his mother is enslaved is an accident of circumstance, not a reflection of his worth or his right to recognition. An accident of circumstance? You chose to force yourself upon that woman year after year. You chose to continue that perverse relationship well beyond any natural limit. You chose to plant your seed in a 71-year-old slave. None of that was accidental. I never forced Hattie to do anything. Oh, please. She is your property. She cannot refuse you. That is the very definition of force. You do not understand the relationship we have shared. You never have. I understand perfectly. You have committed adultery with a slave for nearly 40 years, and now you want to reward that sin by disinheriting your legitimate family. I will not permit it. You will not permit it? You seem to forget who is master of this house. And you seem to forget that masters die. When you are gone, Cornelius, your daughters and I will determine what happens to this estate and everyone on it, including your precious Marcus and his decrepit mother. The argument continued for another hour, growing increasingly bitter, ending only when Cornelius suffered a spell of chest pain that required Dr. Ashford to be summoned. But the lines had been drawn, and everyone at Magnolia Grove understood that the plantation's future had become a battlefield. August brought a new development that changed the calculus of the conflict. Cornelius Wade suffered a severe stroke on the 15th of the month, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. He remained alive but incapacitated. His right side, useless, his speech reduced to slurred fragments that only those closest to him could interpret. Dr. Ashford pronounced him unlikely to recover fully, estimating that he might survive months or perhaps a few years in his diminished state, but would never again manage his own affairs. Caroline Wade moved swiftly to consolidate her position. Within days, she had petitioned the Warren County Court for authority to manage the estate on behalf of her incapacitated husband. Her lawyer argued that Caroline, as the surviving spouse, was the natural and appropriate guardian of her husband's interests during his disability. The petition was supported by statements from neighbors attesting to Caroline's competence and Cornelius's recent mental decline. The Wade daughters and their husbands filed competing claims, seeking to have the estate placed under the control of a neutral trustee until the matter of inheritance could be properly resolved. They argued that Caroline had a personal interest in the outcome that made her unsuitable as sole guardian of their father's property. They produced their own witnesses who testified that Cornelius had expressed concerns about his wife's judgment and had indicated a desire to revise his estate plans before his stroke intervened. Theodore Carlyle, acting on instructions that Cornelius had given before his incapacity, filed a third set of documents. These included a codicil to Cornelius's will, dated July 20th, 1854, that specifically provided for Marcus's future. The codicil directed that Marcus be freed upon Cornelius's death, that he be removed to a free state for education, and that a trust be established from the proceeds of selling a specified portion of the estate's land, the income from which would support Marcus's upbringing and eventual establishment in a profession. The codicil also contained a provision that shocked even those who thought they understood the depth of Cornelius's attachment to Hattie and their son. It directed that Hattie Crawford be freed immediately upon Cornelius's death and provided with an annuity sufficient to support her in comfort for the remainder of her life. It further specified that if Hattie predeceased Marcus, her share of the trust should pass to him, and it included language recognizing Marcus as Cornelius's natural son, entitled to all the moral, if not legal, rights of paternity. Caroline's lawyers challenged the codicil as the product of an incompetent mind pointing to the medical testimony about Cornelius's decline and the inherent irrationality of providing so generously for an illegitimate slave child while neglecting the legitimate claims of a legal wife and recognized daughters. They demanded that the codicil be invalidated and that the estate be distributed according to Cornelius's earlier will, which made standard provisions for Caroline and divided the remainder among the surviving children of his previous marriages. The legal battle that followed consumed the attention of Warren County society for the better part of 2 years. It involved multiple hearings, competing expert witnesses on the question of Cornelius's mental capacity, investigations into the authenticity of the codicil's signature, and increasingly vicious accusations traded between the parties. Meanwhile, Cornelius Wade lingered in his sick room, alive but unable to participate meaningfully in the fight over his legacy, his fate, and that of his youngest son, hanging on the outcome of courtroom arguments he could not fully comprehend. The courthouse in Vicksburg became the stage for a drama that combined elements of family tragedy, racial politics, and legal precedent in ways that fascinated observers throughout the region. Spectators filled the galleries during the key hearings, drawn by the scandalous nature of the case and the prominence of the families involved. Newspaper correspondents from as far away as New Orleans and Memphis sent dispatches describing the proceedings, though they carefully avoided the most salacious details that respectable publications could not print. The first major hearing, held in November 1855, focused on the question of Cornelius Wade's mental capacity at the time he signed the codicil. Caroline's lawyers called 3 physicians who had treated Cornelius in the months before his stroke, each of whom testified to observing signs of mental decline. They described episodes of confusion, moments when Cornelius failed to recognize longtime associates, decisions that seemed to contradict his previous patterns of behavior. They offered their professional opinions that a man showing such symptoms could not be considered legally competent to make major changes to his estate planning. Theodore Carlyle countered with his own medical witnesses, including Dr. Ashford, who testified that he had found Cornelius mentally acute during his visits in the spring and early summer of 1854. Dr. Ashford described conversations with Cornelius about plantation management, about the cotton market, about various business matters that demonstrated clear thinking and sound judgment. He acknowledged that Cornelius showed occasional forgetfulness, but argued that such lapses were normal for a man of his age and did not indicate the kind of comprehensive mental failure that would invalidate his legal decisions. The second major hearing, in February 1856, addressed the question of the codicil's authenticity. Caroline's lawyers produced handwriting experts who claimed to detect irregularities in Cornelius's signature on the document, suggesting that it might have been forged or signed under duress. They pointed to slight variations in the formation of certain letters, to the pressure and flow of the pen strokes, to various technical details that they argued were inconsistent with Cornelius's authenticated signature on other documents. Carlyle responded with his own experts who reached opposite conclusions, affirming the signature as genuine and explaining the supposed irregularities as natural variations that occurred in any person's handwriting over time. He also produced witnesses who had been present when Cornelius signed the codicil, including a notary public who testified that Cornelius had read the document carefully, asked clarifying questions about several provisions, and signed it in his presence with full understanding of what he was doing. The final hearing, held in September 1856, addressed the fundamental legal question of whether Mississippi law permitted what Cornelius had attempted. This hearing drew the largest crowds and the most intense interest, as it raised issues that went far beyond the Wade family's particular circumstances. The question of whether a slaveholder could free his enslaved children and provide for them through his estate touched on some of the most sensitive aspects of Southern society, challenging the assumptions that maintained the rigid hierarchy of race and status. Caroline's lawyers argued that Mississippi law was clear and unambiguous. Enslaved people could not be freed by will without specific legislative authorization. Property could not be diverted from legitimate heirs to illegitimate children of color. The entire legal structure of the state was designed to maintain the separation between the races and to ensure that the fruits of white labor, including the labor of enslaved people who were themselves property, remained in white hands. Cornelius's codicil, however sincere his intentions might have been, violated fundamental principles of Mississippi law and public policy. Carlyle made his arguments with passion and eloquence, invoking the natural rights of fathers to provide for their children, the moral weight of deathbed wishes, the fundamental humanity that transcended legal categories. He cited cases from other states where courts had found ways to honor the intentions of slaveholders who wished to free their enslaved children. He appealed to the conscience of the judges, asking them to consider what justice truly required in a case where a father's love for his son conflicted with laws designed to deny that such love was even possible. Throughout this period, Hattie Crawford continued to care for Marcus in the small room adjacent to the kitchen. Her own health, surprisingly robust immediately after the birth, began to decline as the months passed. The strain of nursing an infant at her age, combined with the emotional toll of the conflict swirling around her and her son, gradually sapped her strength. By the spring of 1855, she was spending much of each day in bed, rising only to feed Marcus and attend to his most basic needs before collapsing again into exhausted sleep. Dr. Ashford, who continued his regular visits to monitor both Cornelius and Hattie, noted in his journals his concern about her deteriorating condition. The extraordinary vitality that sustained her through pregnancy and childbirth appears to be failing. I have seen this pattern before. Though rarely in circumstances so unusual, it is as though she burned through a reserve of strength that should have been impossible to access. And now the debt is coming due. I fear she may not survive the year. The enslaved community watched Hattie's decline with grief and frustration. They could do little to help her beyond offering small kindnesses, extra food from the kitchen, time away from work, to sit with her and Marcus, prayers offered in the quiet of the quarters at night. But they felt her loss coming, felt the approaching end of a life that had touched so many of theirs over 6 decades of shared bondage. One evening in April, Dinah, the midwife who had assisted at Marcus's birth, sat with Hattie as the older woman drifted in and out of sleep. Marcus lay in his cradle nearby, watching the firelight with the intent gaze that had become characteristic of him. Dinah later recorded the conversation in a letter she dictated to a northern missionary after the war, one of the few direct testimonies we have from any of the enslaved people at Magnolia Grove. Miss Hattie woke up clear for a while that night, Dinah's letter recounted. She looked at me and at Marcus and she said, "I done lived too long for this world. Seen too much. Lost too much. Should have died years ago. But something kept me here." She looked at Marcus and said, "I think I know now why I stayed. The Lord wanted me to bring this one into the world, wanted me to see him started before I go." I asked her what she thought would happen to Marcus when she was gone. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Master Cornelius loved me in his way. Not the way a man should love a woman, not like equals, but something more than the others ever got from him. He wants to do right by this child. Whether he can or not, that ain't up to him anymore. But I believe he tried. And maybe that's worth something." She asked me to promise that I would watch over Marcus if I could, that I would tell him about me when he was old enough to understand, that I would make sure he knew he was wanted, that he was loved, even if everything else fell apart. I promised. It was all I could give her. Cornelius Wade died on June 4, 1855, 15 months after the stroke that had ended his active life. His death, expected for months, still sent shockwaves through the plantation and the ongoing legal proceedings. The question of who controlled Magnolia Grove, which had been held in abeyance during his incapacity, now demanded immediate resolution. The court ultimately sided with a compromise position, appointing a trustee to manage the estate while the various claims were adjudicated. The trustee, a respected Vicksburg banker named Augustus Phillips, was tasked with maintaining the plantation's operations, preventing waste of assets, and preserving the status quo until a final determination could be made about the validity of the codicil and the respective rights of the claimants. Hattie Crawford did not live to see this resolution. She died on May 19, 1855, 2 weeks before Cornelius, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated exhaustion of 73 years of life and labor. Her death was recorded in the plantation slave register with a single line: Hattie, born 1782, Virginia, died May 19, 1855. Cause, natural. There was no mention of her 11 children, her 46 years at Magnolia Grove, her decades-long relationship with the plantation's owner, or the miracle child she had borne at an age when such things should have been impossible. The circumstances of her final days were recorded in more detail by Dr. Ashford, who attended her during her decline, and by Dinah, who remained with her constantly in those last weeks. According to their accounts, Hattie faced death with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire life. She spoke little, conserving her strength for the essential tasks of caring for Marcus and occasionally offering words of guidance to the women who would continue caring for him after she was gone. In her final weeks, Hattie seemed to find a peace that had eluded her throughout her long years of bondage. She spent hours each day simply holding Marcus, watching him sleep, memorizing his features, as if she could carry the image of him into whatever came after death. She spoke to him in quiet tones, words that the women attending her could not always hear clearly, but that seemed to be a mixture of endearments, prayers, and instructions for a future she would not share. On her last day, Hattie asked Dinah to bring her the small bundle that contained the locks of hair from her 11 children. She held it against her chest while cradling Marcus with her other arm, her eyes moving between the physical presence of her living son and the meager remnants of the children who had been taken from her. She spoke their names aloud, one by one, as if calling them to witness this final moment: Jacob, Ruth, Rebecca, Isaiah, Thomas, Benjamin, Mary, Joseph, Daniel, Elizabeth, Pearl. And then, looking down at the infant in her arms, she added one more name: Marcus. My last, my miracle, my hope. She died that evening, shortly after sunset, with Marcus sleeping peacefully beside her and Dinah holding her hand. Dr. Ashford, who had been summoned when her breathing became labored, recorded the time of death as approximately 7:45 in the evening. He noted in his journal that she passed without apparent pain or struggle, her eyes fixed on her son's face until the moment they closed for the last time. The enslaved community mourned Hattie in the ways that were available to them. There could be no public funeral, no formal recognition of her passing, no ceremony that acknowledged the significance of her life. But in the quarters that night, and for many nights thereafter, people gathered to share memories of her, to sing the songs she had loved, to pray for her soul, and for the soul of the child she had left behind. They spoke of her strength, her endurance, her refusal to be entirely broken by a system designed to crush the humanity of everyone it touched. The women who had promised to care for Marcus took up their duties with renewed determination. They saw in him the continuation of Hattie's story, the living proof that her final act of creation had meaning beyond the personal. They vowed to protect him as best they could, to honor the promises they had made to his mother, to ensure that at least one of Hattie Crawford's children would have a chance at something better than the fate that had claimed all his siblings. Marcus, 14 months old when his mother died, was too young to understand the loss. But those who cared for him in the weeks that followed noticed changes in his behavior. He slept poorly, cried more frequently, seemed to search for something or someone who was no longer there. Whether this represented genuine grief or merely the disruption of his routine, no one could say with certainty. But Dinah and the other women who had promised Hattie they would watch over her son did their best to provide comfort, holding him through the difficult nights, singing the same songs Hattie had sung, trying to preserve some connection to the mother he would never consciously remember. The legal proceedings dragged on for another 18 months after Cornelius's death. Caroline Wade fought tenaciously to have the codicil invalidated, bringing forward expert witnesses who testified that the document's provisions were so irrational, so contrary to the interests of a reasonable man, that they could only represent the product of a diseased mind. She produced evidence of Cornelius's confusion in the months before his stroke, documented his occasional inability to recognize longtime acquaintances, emphasized the inherent impropriety of his relationship with Hattie as proof of moral and mental decay. The Wade daughters and their husbands eventually reached a settlement with Caroline, agreeing to divide the bulk of the estate while jointly opposing the provisions for Marcus. They argued that regardless of their father's intentions, Mississippi law simply did not permit what he had attempted. An enslaved child could not be freed by will without specific legislative authorization. Property could not be diverted from legitimate heirs to provide for illegitimate offspring. The codicil, even if genuine and the product of a sound mind, was legally void. Theodore Carlyle fought a losing battle to preserve his client's wishes. He argued that the moral weight of a father's final testament should override technical legal obstacles. He pointed to the documented evidence of the relationship between Cornelius and Hattie, the genuine affection that had persisted for decades, the clear intention to acknowledge and provide for a child who was, whatever the law might say, unquestionably of Wade blood. He lost on every point. The final court ruling, issued in January 1857, invalidated the codicil in its entirety. The estate was divided between Caroline and the surviving daughters according to the provisions of Cornelius's earlier will. Marcus remained enslaved, his status unchanged by his father's attempts to free him. The property at Magnolia Grove, including its enslaved population, was awarded to Caroline Wade as the surviving spouse's share of the estate. What happened to Marcus after the ruling depended on which account one believes. The official plantation records, maintained by Caroline and her new overseer after she consolidated control, show that Marcus was sold in March 1857, at nearly 3 years of age, to a trader named Josiah Blackburn, who operated primarily in the New Orleans market. The sale price was recorded as $400, unusually high for a child that age, attributed in the records to his light complexion and apparent intelligence. But alternative accounts, preserved in letters and oral histories from the formerly enslaved people of Magnolia Grove, tell a different story. According to these sources, Dinah and 2 other enslaved women, acting on the promises they had made to Hattie, arranged for Marcus to be hidden when the trader came to collect him. A child of approximately the same age, the orphaned son of a woman who had died the previous winter, was substituted in his place. The trader, unfamiliar with the plantation's individual slaves and concerned primarily with filling his quota, did not notice the switch. Marcus, these accounts claim, was smuggled off the plantation within days, passed through a network of enslaved people and free blacks who maintained connections across the region. He was taken first to a community of free people of color in New Orleans, then north to Cincinnati, where abolitionists arranged for his care and education. By the time Caroline discovered the substitution, if she ever did, Marcus had disappeared into the vast population of light-skinned black people who existed in uncertain status throughout the borderland between slavery and freedom. Whether this alternative account represents historical truth or hopeful mythology is impossible to determine with certainty. No records have been found that definitively trace Marcus's fate after 1857. No adult Marcus Crawford or Marcus Wade appears in census records from Ohio or other free states in subsequent decades. The child who was sold to Josiah Blackburn may have been Marcus himself. passing through the brutal machinery of the slave trade to an unknown destination, or he may have been the substitute the alternative accounts describe, sacrificed so that Hattie's son might have a cruising chance at freedom. What we know for certain is that Magnolia Grove continued under Caroline Wade's management until the Civil War brought an end to the world that had created it. The plantation was occupied by Union forces in 1863. Its enslaved population freed by military decree before the Emancipation Proclamation formally ended slavery throughout the Confederacy. Caroline fled to relatives in Alabama, taking what valuables she could carry, and died there in 1867, bitter and impoverished, still convinced that her husband's madness and his slave concubine's scheming had robbed her of the prosperity she deserved. The formerly enslaved people of Magnolia Grove scattered after the war, some remaining in Warren County as sharecroppers and laborers, others migrating to cities in search of better opportunities, still others joining the great movements of Black Americans, seeking land and community in the uncertain freedom of Reconstruction. Among those who stayed in the region, the story of Hattie Crawford and her miracle child became part of the oral tradition, told and retold, with variations that accumulated over generations. Dr. William Ashford, whose medical journals provide much of what we know about the circumstances of Marcus's birth, continued practicing in Warren County until his retirement in 1870. His journals were discovered among his papers by his granddaughter in 1923, and portions were published in a medical history journal in 1931. The article generated brief interest among physicians curious about the extreme limits of human fertility. But the racial dimensions of the story, the relationship between master and enslaved woman, the child who bore both their bloodlines, were largely ignored in that era's scholarly discourse. The case of Hattie Crawford remains, medically speaking, an anomaly, without satisfactory explanation. Modern reproductive science confirms that natural conception at age 71 is essentially impossible. The ovaries having ceased to function decades earlier, the uterus no longer capable of sustaining pregnancy. Yet the documentation from 1854 appears genuine, the witnesses numerous and credible, the child himself undeniably real. Some historians have suggested that Hattie's age may have been misrecorded, that she might have been a decade or more younger than the plantation records indicated. Others have proposed more elaborate explanations involving misattributed parentage or deliberate falsification of documents. But among those who study the intimate history of American slavery, Hattie Crawford's story carries meanings that transcend medical curiosities. It speaks to the complex, often incomprehensible relationships that developed within a system designed to reduce human beings to property. It illuminates the ways enslaved women navigated impossible circumstances, finding agency where none was supposed to exist, forming connections that defied the categories their society imposed. And it reminds us that the children born of these forced and forbidden unions, children like Marcus Crawford, carried in their very existence the contradictions that would eventually tear that society apart. As we conclude this exploration of one of history's most unusual births, we are left with questions that may never be answered. Did Marcus survive to know freedom? Did he ever learn the full story of his origins? The aged mother who loved him, the conflicted father who tried to provide for him, the desperate women who may have risked everything to save him. Did he carry within him any memory, however faint, of the 14 months he spent in Hattie Crawford's arms? We may never know, but we can remember Hattie herself, a woman who endured 7 decades of bondage, who bore 11 children into slavery and watched them disappear one by one, who somehow, against all natural law, produced one more life at the very end of her own. We can honor her determination to see that final child started, her hope that he might find a better fate than his siblings, her refusal to surrender completely to a system that claimed ownership of her body and her children. And we can recognize that stories like hers Stories of impossible births and forbidden loves and desperate acts of resistance were far more common than official records acknowledge. The history of American slavery is filled with Hatties and Marcuses, with relationships that defied categories and children who embodied contradictions. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as curiosities or scandals, but as testimonies to the irreducible humanity that no system of oppression could entirely destroy. Thank you for joining us on Whispers in Frames for another chapter of the stories that history tried to forget. If this account moved you, please share it with others who should know these hidden truths. Subscribe to our channel and enable notifications so you never miss an episode. And remember, the past is never really past. It lives on in the blood and bones and memories of those who came after, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be told, waiting to be heard. Until next time, keep questioning the official narratives, keep seeking the buried truths, and keep honoring the memories of those who suffered and survived so that we might exist today. This has been Whispers in Frames. The darkness remembers what the light tries to forget.